It happened during a season in the ministry of Jesus when the weight of his mission was becoming clearer to those who followed him most closely. Crowds still gathered to hear his teaching, to witness miracles, to be near the one whose words carried life and power. Yet beneath the surface of these moments of joy and wonder, the shadows of the cross were beginning to stretch long. The path ahead was not only about healing and proclamation, it was also about sacrifice and suffering. Against this backdrop, a single event stands apart with breathtaking intensity, a moment when the veil between heaven and earth seemed to thin, and the disciples caught a glimpse of glory unlike anything they had ever seen. Jesus had been moving with deliberate purpose toward Jerusalem, speaking words that puzzled his followers. He had begun to tell them that he would be handed over to the authorities, that he would suffer, be killed, and rise again. These were not the expectations the disciples carried when they first left their nets and tax tables to follow him. They imagined the arrival of a kingdom filled with visible power, a restoration of Israel's greatness. Yet the way Jesus spoke revealed a different kind of kingdom, one that would be established not through political force, but through humility, obedience, and love unto death. It is in this setting, with the cross looming on the horizon, that he took 3 of his disciples to a high mountain, away from the noise and demands of the crowds. The Gospels present this ascent to the mountain as intentional, not a casual walk, but a purposeful journey. Mountains in the story of God's people were never just scenery. They were places where the voice of God had been heard, where his presence had descended in fire or cloud, where covenants had been spoken and renewed. For Peter, James, and John following Jesus, up that slope may have stirred memories of ancient stories from the scriptures they had known since childhood, stories of Moses climbing Mount Sinai to receive the law, or Elijah meeting God not in the wind or the fire, but in a gentle whisper upon a mountainside. By this time in their journey, the disciples had already witnessed miracles that would mark them forever. Blind eyes opened, storms silenced by a word, the dead called back to life. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to experience. It would not be another healing, another parable, or another act of mercy. What awaited them was a revelation of who Jesus truly was, not as they had seen him in the dust and sweat of daily travel, but as he is in the eternal glory he shares with the Father. The timing of this moment cannot be overlooked. It came just after Peter's bold confession that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and just after Jesus began to explain that the Messiah's path would lead through suffering. It came at a moment when the disciples' understanding needed strengthening, when their faith required a vision that could sustain them through the darkness ahead. The glory they were about to see was not the end of the story, but it would be a light to carry with them into the valley of trial. Even as they reached the higher slopes, perhaps catching their breath from the climb, they could not have guessed the purpose of their journey. They were simply with their teacher, trusting his lead. Yet what would soon unfold would remain imprinted on their hearts for the rest of their lives, shaping their testimony and their hope. Before the agony of Gethsemane, before the shouts of the crowd at Golgotha, before the tomb was sealed, these men would see something that defied human description, a vision meant to prepare them for the cost of following him and to reveal, if only for a moment, the fullness of the one they called Lord. The scene of the Transfiguration begins with a climb, an upward movement toward a place set apart from the rhythms of daily life. Scripture does not name the exact location, which has led to much reflection and debate across the centuries. Some have looked to Mount Tabor, a gentle yet prominent rise in the Galilean landscape, crowned in later centuries with churches that honor the memory of this event. Others have turned their gaze toward Mount Hermon, a vast and imposing peak near Caesarea Philippi, whose snow-capped summit towers above the surrounding valleys. Each location carries its own sense of majesty, yet the greater truth lies not in the precise coordinates, but in the symbolic weight of the setting. In the biblical story, mountains have always been more than landforms. They are places where the human heart seems closer to heaven, where the air feels thin and the horizon stretches far. where the soul becomes more attentive to the presence of God. From Mount Ararat, where the ark came to rest, to Mount Moriah, where Abraham's faith was tested, to Mount Sinai, where the covenant was spoken in thunder and flame, the mountains are woven into the story of God's dealings with His people. Each peak holds a memory of a moment when God drew near. The climb itself holds meaning. Leaving the lowlands behind, ascending toward a place less touched by human noise, mirrors the spiritual journey of one who seeks God. In many ways, the mountain represents separation from the ordinary, a withdrawal from distraction, and a readiness to receive what cannot be given in the rush of the marketplace or the pressure of the crowd. For Jesus and the three who followed Him, this ascent was both a physical effort and a spiritual preparation for the revelation to come. When the disciples reached the height, they stepped into an environment that felt different from the roads they had traveled before. The elevation offered a vast view of the land below, perhaps fields and villages scattered like small points of life in the distance. The air was cooler, the wind more insistent, the light more intense. These details, though ordinary to the mountain itself, became the backdrop for an extraordinary encounter. The beauty of the setting was not the main focus, but it served as a fitting stage for what was about to unfold. Mountains also carry the sense of being boundaries between realms. The ground beneath one's feet still belongs to the earth, but the mind feels lifted toward the sky. This is why many have described such places as points where heaven and earth seem to touch. On this particular day, for Peter, James, and John, the mountain would not only suggest that meeting point, it would become the very place where the unseen glory of heaven broke into visible reality before their eyes. Jesus did not take all 12 disciples with Him up the mountain. Instead, He selected 3, Peter, James, and John. This choice was deliberate, not random, and it reflected the unique place these men held in His ministry. From earlier moments in the Gospels, it is clear that these 3 were often drawn into situations that required a deeper witness. They had been present when Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead, and they would later be the ones closest to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane during His time of deep anguish. Peter was the outspoken one, quick to speak, quick to act, sometimes bold to the point of overconfidence. His confession of Jesus as the Messiah had been a defining moment, yet his understanding of what that meant was still incomplete. James and John, brothers and sons of Zebedee, were known for their passion and intensity, so much so that Jesus called them the sons of thunder. They carried a zeal that, at times, flared into ambition, but which, when tempered by grace, would become a strength in proclaiming the gospel. By taking these 3, Jesus was not showing favoritism in the way the world understands it. Rather, He was equipping those who would bear significant responsibility in the days ahead. Peter would become a central leader in the early church, preaching with authority at Pentecost. James would be the first of the apostles to face martyrdom, sealing his testimony with his own blood. John would live to see visions of heaven and record the revelation that closes the New Testament. Each would face trials that demanded unshakable faith, and each would need the memory of this moment to carry them through. It is possible that the personalities of these 3 also shaped why they were chosen. Peter's leadership, James's courage, and John's deep capacity for love and spiritual perception created a combination that could absorb the significance of what they were about to witness. The others would learn of it later, but for now, these 3 would be entrusted with a glimpse of divine reality that was too much for the wider group to bear in that moment. Their inclusion in this event reminds us that while Jesus calls many to follow Him, there are times when He draws some into experiences that prepare them for particular roles. These are not moments to boast about, but moments to carry humbly, with the understanding that they are given for the sake of serving others. The 3 would carry this vision not as a private treasure, but as a testimony to strengthen the faith of the whole community when the time was right. When the Gospels describe what happened next, their words strain under the weight of the vision. Jesus' appearance changed before the eyes of the 3 disciples. His face shone like the sun, and his clothing became white beyond anything the world could produce. The brightness was not a reflection from some external light, nor the result of the sun's angle on the mountain. It was light that came from within him, the radiance of his own eternal nature, breaking through the veil of his humanity. Up to this point, the disciples had known Jesus in the ordinary ways of daily life, walking dusty roads together, eating meals, sharing moments of joy and of weariness. They had seen him express compassion, sorrow, and righteous anger. Yet in this moment, they saw something entirely different. The teacher they followed was revealed as the Lord of glory, the same Word through whom all things were made. What they witnessed was not a vision of what he might become, but a revelation of what he had always been. The light they saw recalls the language of Psalm 104, verse 2, which speaks of God covering himself with light as with a garment. In this moment, that truth became visible in the person of Jesus. His glory was not a borrowed splendor like the glow of Moses after descending Mount Sinai. It was his own, uncreated and eternal. This was the light that existed before the foundation of the world, the light that no darkness can overcome. Such a sight would have overwhelmed any human senses. The brilliance, the purity, the holiness contained in that radiance spoke of a reality untouched by sin or corruption. It was the kind of light that exposes all falsehood, that drives away fear, that reveals the truth of God's nature. For the disciples, this was not only a vision of power, but of perfect goodness and love. The moment also served as a quiet declaration that the road to the cross would not end in defeat. The one who would soon be arrested, mocked, and crucified was the same one whose glory now blazed on the mountain. The world would see him humbled, but the disciples were given this foretaste of his victory. That vision would linger in their hearts, a steady flame in the darkness that lay ahead. As the brilliance of Jesus filled their sight, two other figures appeared beside him, Moses and Elijah. For a Jewish mind steeped in the scriptures, the significance could not be missed. Moses was the great lawgiver, the one through whom God had given his covenant commands on Mount Sinai. Elijah was the prophet who confronted idolatry with boldness, calling Israel back to the worship of the true God. Together, they embodied the law and the prophets, the two great pillars of God's revelation to his people. Their presence signaled that the story unfolding on this mountain was the continuation and fulfillment of everything that had come before. Moses had once stood between God and the people, bringing the covenant written on stone. Elijah had stood on another mountain, hearing the gentle whisper of God's voice after the storm. Now both stood beside the one who was the very Word made flesh. The promises they had carried forward were finding their completion in him. The appearance of Moses and Elijah also bridged the centuries, reminding the disciples that the mission of Jesus was not an isolated event. It was the central chapter in a divine plan that stretched from creation to eternity. The same God who had spoken through the law and the prophets was now speaking through his Son. Every shadow, every symbol, every prophecy was converging in this moment on the mountain. To stand in the company of these figures was to stand within the stream of God as redemptive history. The disciples could see that Jesus was not simply another teacher in a long line of teachers. He was not just a prophet among prophets. He was the one to whom the law pointed and for whom the prophets had waited. Moses and Elijah did not outshine him. They stood in his light. This meeting of the three was more than an extraordinary vision. It was a declaration that the covenant given at Sinai and the prophetic call to faithfulness were finding their ultimate expression in the person of Jesus Christ. The law had prepared the way, the prophets had kept the hope alive, and now the Messiah stood revealed in his glory, the perfect fulfillment of both. The Gospel of Luke offers a rare detail that neither Matthew nor Mark includes. He writes that Moses and Elijah were speaking with Jesus about his departure, the word in the original language being Exodus, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. This choice of word carried immense meaning, especially for those who knew the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. The first Exodus had been God's great act of salvation, leading his people out of slavery and into the covenant land. Now a far greater deliverance was about to take place through Jesus, one that would free humanity from the bondage of sin and death. The conversation between these three was no casual exchange. Moses had once led a nation out of Egypt by the power of God's hand. Elijah had once stood as a solitary voice against the corruption of kings and the worship of false gods. Both had known what it meant to be misunderstood, rejected, and to face opposition for the sake of God's truth. Now they spoke with the one who would face the ultimate rejection and bear the weight of the world's sin upon the cross. For Peter, James, and John, overhearing even a portion of this conversation must have been bewildering. They knew the name Jerusalem as the holy city, the center of worship, the place of the temple. Yet here, Jerusalem was being spoken of as the place where this departure would be fulfilled, a word that hinted at suffering and sacrifice. It was a reminder that glory and suffering were not separate paths, but part of the same divine plan. The presence of Moses and Elijah in this conversation also served as a kind of witness. In the law and the prophets, the scriptures had testified to the coming Messiah and to the redemption he would bring. Now those very figures stood beside him, acknowledging the path he was about to take. They did not come to dissuade him or to question his mission. They came to speak of it, to affirm it, to stand with him in the unfolding of God's purpose. This was a holy moment, one in which the past, present, and future met on the mountain. The disciples were not yet able to grasp its full meaning, but the seed of understanding was planted. One day, when they looked back, they would remember that on the mountain of glory, the talk was not about avoiding the cross, but about fulfilling the mission for which the Son of God had come into the world. As the conversation unfolded, the scene was suddenly enveloped in a cloud, not the dark storm clouds that bring rain, but one of brightness and awe. In the scriptures, such a cloud had always been more than a natural phenomenon. It was the sign of the Shekinah glory, the tangible presence of God among his people. This was the same glory that had descended on Mount Sinai, the same that had filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, the same that had settled upon the temple in the days of Solomon. The cloud in those earlier times had been both a covering and a revelation. It veiled the fullness of God's glory, which no human could behold and live, yet it made his nearness known in a way that could not be mistaken. For the disciples, this bright cloud would have carried echoes of those ancient stories, even if they only understood them dimly in that moment. When the cloud covered them, the separation between the earthly and heavenly seemed to vanish. They were no longer just standing on a high mountain. They were standing in the midst of God's manifested presence. It was a reminder that the God who had spoken in the past was speaking again, and the setting was no accident. The same God who had revealed himself to Moses and Elijah was now revealing his Son to the chosen witnesses. The arrival of the cloud also signaled that what was happening was under divine authority. This was not a private vision born of imagination or a passing dream in the thin mountain air. This was God drawing near, just as he had done when he guided Israel by a pillar of cloud through the wilderness. The same presence that had once led his people now surrounded these disciples on the mountain. For those who knew the history of Israel, this cloud meant that something of supreme importance was taking place. The return of the Shekinah was not a casual event. It was a sign that God was fully involved in what was being revealed, that the message carried by the one standing in glory was the very heart of his will for the world. Out of the bright cloud came a voice unlike any other, filled with authority that needed no proof. It said, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." These words carried the weight of divine affirmation, echoing the declaration that had been heard at Jesus' baptism by the Jordan River. At that earlier moment, the voice had spoken over the beginning of his public ministry. Now the same voice confirmed his identity as he stood on the threshold of his journey to the cross. The declaration left no room for doubt about who Jesus was. He was not merely a prophet, not simply a teacher of wisdom, but the Son of God, loved by the Father with a love that had no beginning and no end. The command that followed, "Listen to him," was more than an instruction to pay attention to his words. It was a call to place his teaching, his will, and his mission above all others. For the disciples, hearing this voice must have been both overwhelming and deeply confirming. They had chosen to follow Jesus, often without fully understanding his ways. Now the Father himself spoke directly, removing all uncertainty about the one they were following. The glory they saw with their eyes was matched by the authority they heard in their ears. The voice from the cloud also placed Jesus above Moses and Elijah, not in a way that diminished them, but in a way that showed their roles were complete in him. The law and the prophets had served as guides and witnesses, but the Son was the fulfillment. To listen to him was to hear the final and fullest revelation of God's heart. In the years to come, this command would echo in the disciples' hearts whenever they faced trials or confusion. The memory of the Father's voice on the mountain would remind them that the path they walked was not one they had chosen on their own. It was the path given by the one who had been declared from heaven as the beloved Son. The vision of Jesus in radiant glory, the sudden appearance of Moses and Elijah, the bright cloud, and the voice from heaven, these were more than human senses were prepared to endure. Matthew records that the disciples fell face down to the ground, terrified. This was not fear in the ordinary sense, like fear of danger or threat. It was the kind of awe that comes when a mortal stands in the presence of the infinite, when the reality of God's holiness presses in with undeniable force. In the scriptures, such reactions were not uncommon. When Isaiah saw the Lord high and exalted, he cried out that he was ruined, for he was a man of unclean lips. When Ezekiel beheld the vision of God's glory, he fell face down. The human heart instinctively knows that in the light of perfect holiness, all pretense is stripped away, nothing remains hidden. For Peter, James, and John, this was a moment when their own smallness and unworthiness became starkly clear. They had walked closely with Jesus, yet here they saw him in a way that exposed the vast gulf between his perfection and their frailty. Even the joy of the vision was wrapped in a sense of trembling, for to encounter God's glory is to be confronted with the truth of who he is and who we are. Fear in such moments is not without purpose. It teaches the heart reverence. It strips away the casual familiarity that can sometimes dull our awareness of who God truly is. The disciples' posture on the ground was an act of surrender, whether they consciously thought of it that way or not. Before such glory, there is nothing left to do but bow low. Yet this fear was not meant to crush them. It was part of the encounter, a necessary awakening to the reality that the one they followed was more than they had yet understood. In time, this fear would be transformed into worship, but for now, they lay silent and trembling, waiting for what would come next. In the midst of their trembling, something happened that turned the moment from overwhelming terror to deep reassurance. Jesus came to them and touched them, telling them not to be afraid. This simple act carried a power as great as the voice from the cloud. The same hands that had multiplied bread, healed the sick, and lifted the sinking Peter from the waves now rested on their shoulders, steadying them in the presence of divine glory. The touch of Jesus bridged the chasm between the human and the divine. It reminded the disciples that the one who shone with unapproachable light was also the one who walked with them, who knew their names, who shared their meals, who called them friends. The majesty they had just seen did not erase his nearness. It gave it even greater meaning. By telling them not to be afraid, Jesus was not dismissing the reverence they felt. He was assuring them that in him, the holiness of God had come not to destroy them, but to save them. His presence brought peace where there had been trembling, confidence where there had been uncertainty. The fear that had driven them to the ground was now replaced with the courage to lift their eyes. This moment revealed something profound about the character of Christ. He is both the Lord of glory and the compassionate shepherd. He does not leave his followers paralyzed by the weight of his majesty. Instead, he comes close, speaking words that quiet the heart and restore the soul. When the disciples finally looked up, the scene had changed. The brilliance was gone, The figures of Moses and Elijah had departed, and only Jesus remained. Yet the touch they had felt and the words they had heard would remain with them for the rest of their lives, a lasting reminder that the glory of God and the grace of God meet perfectly in Him. As they descended the mountain, still carrying the weight of what they had just seen, Jesus gave them a command that might have seemed unusual. Do not tell anyone about this vision until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. The instruction was not because the event was unimportant, nor because it should remain hidden forever, but because the timing of its revelation mattered. The disciples themselves struggled to understand fully what they had witnessed, and sharing it too soon could have led to confusion rather than faith. The people of that time already had strong expectations about what the Messiah would be like. Many looked for a leader who would overthrow Roman power, restore Israel's sovereignty, and establish a reign of visible might. To speak of radiant glory on a mountain without the context of the cross and resurrection would have risked feeding those misconceptions, presenting a picture of the Messiah that fit human desire rather than God's plan. Jesus knew that the true meaning of the Transfiguration could only be grasped in the light of His victory over death. Until the resurrection, the disciples were not ready to explain it, and the world was not ready to hear it. Holding the memory in silence was an act of obedience and trust, a recognition that God's plans unfold according to His perfect timing. For Peter, James, and John, this must have been a difficult command. They had seen a vision unlike anything in their lives. Every instinct may have urged them to tell the others immediately, to share the wonder of it. Yet they carried the vision quietly, allowing it to shape them inwardly until the day came when it could be spoken openly as part of the gospel message. This period of silence reminds us that some revelations are not meant for immediate declaration. There are moments in the journey of faith when God shows something that is to be treasured privately for a time, allowed to deepen its roots before it is shared. The disciples' obedience in this small but significant matter prepared them for the larger task of proclaiming the whole truth when the hour came. The timing of the Transfiguration was no accident. It came after Jesus had begun to speak plainly about His coming suffering and death, and before the events in Jerusalem that would bring those words to reality. For the disciples, seeing His glory before witnessing His agony was a mercy, a gift designed to strengthen their faith when everything they thought they understood would be shaken. In that moment on the mountain, they saw the end before the beginning had fully played out. They were given a preview of the victory before stepping into the shadows of apparent defeat. This was not to remove the necessity of the cross, but to show that the cross was not the end. The same Jesus who would be mocked and beaten was the one whose face had shone like the sun, whose garments had gleamed with heavenly light. The vision functioned like a lantern lit before a long night's journey. When the darkness came in Gethsemane, when the shouts of the crowd called for crucifixion, when the tomb was sealed, the memory of the mountain would remain. It would whisper to them that the one they had seen in glory was the same one in whose hands the entire story rested. The connection between the Transfiguration and the resurrection runs deep. Both reveal the reality of Jesus' divine nature. Both stand as declarations that death cannot hold Him. On the mountain, the disciples saw Him as He is eternally. After the resurrection, they would meet Him again in His risen body, and the two moments would complete each other in their understanding. This truth reaches beyond the disciples' experience. For all who follow Christ, the pattern remains. Glory is promised, but it often comes through the path of suffering. The vision of the mountain calls believers to hold on through the trials, knowing that what lies ahead is far greater than the pain of the moment. For those who hear this story today, the Transfiguration still speaks with power. It invites the heart to see Jesus not only as a figure of history, a wise teacher, or a moral example, but as the Lord of glory whose divinity shines without limit. It challenges the mind to remember that following Him means recognizing both His humanity and His eternal majesty. In the rush of daily life, it can be easy to think of Jesus in familiar, comfortable terms. Yet the mountain reminds us that He is far greater than our limited perceptions. His power is not confined to the pages of history or the boundaries of our understanding. He is alive, reigning, and radiant in the fullness of His glory. The vision of the Transfiguration also calls modern believers to seek moments when they can step away from the noise and see Him more clearly. This does not mean climbing a literal mountain, but creating space for prayer, reflection, and worship where the distractions of life fade and the reality of His presence becomes more vivid. Another lesson lies in the disciples' transformation after the event. The glory they saw shaped their courage, deepened their convictions, and fueled their witness. In the same way, seeing Jesus as He truly is changes the way a person lives. It brings hope in hardship, clarity in confusion, and a joy that no circumstance can erase. Ultimately, the Transfiguration invites every believer to live with both reverence and expectation. Reverence, because the one we follow is the eternal Son of God. Expectation, because the glory glimpsed on the mountain is not a distant memory, but a promise of what is to come for all who belong to Him. When the vision faded and the disciples saw only Jesus again, they began the descent from the mountain. It might have been tempting to wish they could remain in that place, surrounded by glory, far from the challenges and conflicts waiting below. Peter's earlier suggestion to build shelters had already hinted at this desire to prolong the moment. Yet Jesus did not lead them upward to escape the world, but to prepare them for their mission within it. The mountain was a place of revelation, but the valley was where their calling would unfold. In the valley were people in need, the sick to be healed, the lost to be found, and the broken to be restored. Remaining in the cloud of glory might have been beautiful, but it would have left the work unfinished. This truth mirrors the spiritual journey of every believer. There are moments of deep encounter with God that lift the heart in worship and awe. These moments are real and precious, but they are not meant to replace the daily walk of faith in the midst of ordinary life. The mountaintop prepares the believer for the valley, giving strength and vision for the work that lies ahead. The disciples' return to the valley was not a return to something lesser. It was the continuation of God's plan, which always moved from revelation to action. What they had seen would shape how they served, how they spoke, and how they endured. The memory of the mountain was a resource for courage, not a place of retreat from responsibility. In time, they would understand that the glory of God is not confined to a single location or moment. The same Jesus who shone with divine light on the mountain would be with them in the crowded streets, in the courts of opposition, and even in the prison cells where some of them would one day bear witness. The mountaintop had given them the vision. The valley would give them the opportunity to live it out. The vision on the mountain was more than a momentary encouragement for 3 disciples. It was a glimpse of the future, a preview of the glory that awaits all who belong to Christ. The dazzling light that radiated from Jesus was the same light in which His people will one day share, when they are transformed into His likeness. The Transfiguration pointed forward to a day when the barriers between heaven and earth will be removed, and the redeemed will see Him face to face. This event stood as a reminder that the story of salvation is moving toward a glorious conclusion. The one who walked the road to Calvary and rose from the grave is the same one who will return in majesty. The moment on the mountain was like an open window through which the disciples could see the end from the middle of the journey. That vision would carry them, and it continues to carry believers today, through trials and seasons of waiting. The scriptures speak of a time when every tear will be wiped away, when death will be no more, when the dwelling place of God will be with His people. The radiance seen at the Transfiguration was a promise of that reality. It was as if God allowed a fragment of eternity to shine into the present moment, so that His followers would never lose sight of where the path leads. For those who believe, this is not a distant dream, but a certain hope. The same power that transformed the appearance of Jesus on the mountain is at work in the hearts of His people now, shaping them, refining them, and preparing them for the day when they will share fully in His glory. The Transfiguration assures us that history is not an endless cycle of struggle. It is a story moving toward a definitive and radiant ending. For those who follow Christ, the vision of the mountain calls the heart to endure with joy, to persevere in faith, and to live in the expectation of that coming day when the light of His presence will fill all things. Thank you for joining us in this journey through one of the most profound and mysterious moments in the life of Jesus. If this message has inspired or encouraged you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss future videos. Click the like button to let us know this content has been valuable to you. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below, and tell us what part of the story spoke most deeply to you. Finally, consider sharing this video with your friends and loved ones, so together we can spread these powerful truths and strengthen faith around the world.